Hello, I'm Ros Atkins. On this week's World Have Your Say, we're going to talk about Iran. We're at the end of another tense week in which we've seen further US sanctions and successful Iranian missile tests and a threat to shut the Strait of Hormuz. Now, in simple terms, we know what the Americans want, and that's for inspectors to be given access to the Iranian nuclear program and for proof that weapons aren't being developed. But what about Iran? What does it want? And are its aspirations reasonable to you? Now, as you'd imagine, we're going to start the programme with Americans and Iranians talking with each other. But wherever you're watching BBC World News, you're welcome to take part too. We're live as ever. You can tweet us using the WHYS hashtag or call us up using the number on the screen. Well, let me introduce you to our first three guests. Dr. Mohammed Marandi is from the University of Tehran. He's live with us from Beirut. Genevieve Abdo is in Washington, D.C. She's from the Century Foundation think tank. And Matthew Koenig is also in Washington. He's a fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. All three of you, you're very welcome to World Have Your Say. Let's get you all talking. Matthew, perhaps we could start with you. What's your perception of Iran and what it wants from this current standoff with America?
Well, I think Iran has two primary strategic goals. The first is that the current theocratic government wants to continue to exist. And second, I think it wants to be the dominant state in the Middle East, and it sees the acquisition of nuclear weapons as key to achieving both of those goals.
Dr. Marandi, do you agree?
No, not at all. I think that it's quite clear that Iran's nuclear program is the right of Iranians. The vast majority of Iranians, according to polls that have been carried out for years, have supported the nuclear program. It's a program that began before the revolution with the help of Western countries, and billions of dollars were invested in it. And the Iranians have tried to resolve the issue, despite the fact that the IAEA is Western-dominated. It has tried to resolve the issue. But the problem is that the United States and its allies really, the problem is more than just a nuclear program. It's an issue of hegemony and Iran's independence.
Genevieve, let's bring you in.
Well, I think that, yes, Iran needs to be more transparent about its nuclear program, and that's been documented for years by the IAEA. It's also been documented for years that Iran has misled the IAEA. But I think having said that, we're at a point now, and as I sit in Washington, just listening to the alarmist rhetoric coming from not only sort of the right wing of the political system here, but even the Obama administration, this is what I believe is in part responsible for what appears to be Iran's aggressive behavior. Iran perceives the situation to be such that a war is inevitable. And I think that the alarmist rhetoric coming from Washington is making the situation worse rather than trying to calm both governments, create some sort of calming atmosphere for both governments.
Well, Matthew, I want to bring you in on this because I and lots of people have been reading a piece you've written online where you make the case for an American attack on Iran. So what would you say to the concerns Genevieve has?
Well, I think the fact of the matter is that we're rapidly approaching a point where the United States and Western countries are going to be forced to make a choice between two unattractive options. As Iran's nuclear program continues to develop, we'll be forced to choose between simply allowing Iran to have nuclear weapons, which I think would be devastating for international security, peace and security, or conducting a preventive military strike designed to eliminate Iran's nuclear facilities. And I think that both of those options are unattractive, but a force to choose a military strike would be the least bad option. So I disagree that talking about this is somehow making things worse. I think this is the most important national security issue facing the United States right now. I think it's high time that we have a public discussion about our options and about the military option, which I'm afraid we might be forced to use.
And just before we bring in a former Iranian ambassador to the UN, Dr. Marandi in Beirut, I'm sure you'll want to respond to Matthew.
Well, it's obvious that the United States is already engaging in acts of war against Iran. the fact that they are trying to strangle the Iranian economy and hurt the Iranian people through imposing sanctions on the central bank and imposing an oil embargo, and also illegally trying to force third countries from dealing with Iran, is itself the most barbaric and crude sort of anti-Iranian policy, short of a military war itself. People like Ron Paul have said this is an act of war. If the United States continues down this route, and it's based upon a dishonest assumption, and that is that Iran's nuclear program has a military aspect to it, which it does not and never has had, then I think that the United States will may mistakenly cross a red line. And the Iranians, if they are strangled, if the United States tries to take the Iranians by the throat, then the Iranians will have no option but to retaliate. And I think it would be a major miscalculation on behalf of the Americans and its allies to think that Iran cannot defend itself. Iran is a very powerful country, and I think the Israelis made the same miscalculation. Just one very important point, and that is the United States, on the one hand, says that Iran is a major threat, yet on the other, they try to imply that Iran does not have the ability to defend itself. And these are two very contradictory statements. The reality of the matter is that the Iranian nuclear program is peaceful, but Iran is a very powerful country, and it will defend itself if attacked and if you try to strangle it.
Dr. Morandi, thanks for those comments. Matthew Koenig in Washington, D.C. for yours too. And if you're watching and want to speak to any of our guests, they're all live here on BBC World News on World Have Your Say. You can call up and speak to them or tweet them. The number's country code 44 2070 83 72 72. I'll remind you what the IAEA, the UN's nuclear watchdog, had to say in November. In its report, it said the agency, the IAEA, has serious concerns regarding possible military dimensions to Iran's nuclear program. Okay, let's bring in another guest to speak with us. Dr. Manzoor Farhang is a former Iranian ambassador to the UN. Dr. Farhang, thank you very much indeed for joining us live from Vermont. We appreciate your time. What do you think is the goal of the Iranians at the moment?
Thank you very much. The first point to be aware of is that the Iranian regime has absolutely no legitimacy to speak for the Iranian people. It's a dictatorial state that puts the critics in jail, torture, execution, and systematic suppression of opinion in Iran is actually the manner by which the Iranian regime imposes itself on the society, therefore discussing what the public in Iran thinks about the Iranian nuclear weapon.
So you question whether the Iranian government can represent its people, but at the moment the Iranian government is in charge in Iran. What do you think its objectives are?
First, I want to say that because it has no legitimacy, it is extremely fearful and insecure. The first objective of Iran in pursuing at least the capacity to make nuclear weapons comes from insecurity. The second element is its ideological expansion over the past 33 years. All Iranian leaders, including Ayatollah Khomeini and Ayatollah Khamenei, have expressed their interest to expand the influence of the Iranian revolution, and they want to have that nuclear capacity in order to influence the politics of the region and yet enjoy impunity from external reaction.
But Dr. Farhang, my question is, you say the Iranians are feeling insecure. Well, maybe Matthew from Washington, D.C., from the Council on Foreign Relations, I could put to you that actually they've got good reason to be insecure. America is basing military operations in various countries nearby to Iran. It obviously invaded Iraq a few years back now. Hasn't it got some good reasons to be concerned?
There is no question that there is some reason.
One moment, Dr. Farhang. Let me just hear Matthew respond to that point.
Well, I think the primary conflict of interest right now between the United States and Iran concerns Iran's nuclear program. So I think that actually by pursuing this uranium enrichment program that's gotten into so much controversy with the international community, Iran is making itself less secure. So I think if security is what it wants, it would be better off to give up the uranium enrichment program, which, as I said before, I'm afraid is going to lead to a serious confrontation between Iran and the West.
Okay, thank you very much indeed for that point. Let's pull up a message here. Johnny Tremaine from Abulio Capital Management writes, I think this is just increased saber rattling. It would be absolutely crazy for the Iranians to close down the Straits of Hormuz. Not only would it hurt the West, it would hurt the global economy and it would hurt Iran. What about that point, Dr. Morandi in Beirut? Wouldn't that be counterproductive to shut the Strait of Hormuz as has been threatened?
The Iranians definitely do not want to shut down the Strait of Hormuz. But the problem is that the United States, by engaging in an act of war, by trying to strangle the Iranian economy and the Europeans by intentionally hurting ordinary Iranians, will leave the Iranian government but with no option but to take retaliatory measures. It could be by carrying out stop and search missions on ships going through the Strait of Hormuz, for example. But I would like to also respond to two other issues. One is that when we speak of the international community, I think it's highly misleading because usually the West considers itself to be the international community, which is not the case. For example, the non-aligned movement, which consists of 120 countries in the world, it's alone, they have consistently, from the very beginning of this issue on the Iranian nuclear program, they have defended Iran's position and they have sided with Iran. And another important point is that the recent IAEA report was given by the chief who, if you look at the WikiLeaks documents, he's very much in the pocket of the United States. He owes his job to the United States. So it's not a balanced report. The IAEA is a body that is dominated by Western countries, and even its bureaucracy is dominated by Westerners. But there is absolutely no proof whatsoever, just as the Russian Deputy Foreign Minister just said a few days ago, that there's any new military aspect to the Iranian program. Iran is working within the framework of the NPT, and you cannot expect Iran to give up its program.
And you're quite right to say there is no
dollars have been invested in it.
You're quite right to say there's no definitive proof that this nuclear development is for military purposes. However, the IAEA says it is increasingly concerned about the possible existence in Iran of undisclosed nuclear-related activities involving military-related organizations. Now, Dr. Morandi, just hold your thought there because we're going to take a break in a moment. We'll see you on our Facebook page. Says Iran appears to be on a path of self-destruction, and Shafi in India on Twitter, picking up on a point several of our guests have made, said, it appears to me that Iran wants to be supreme in the Persian Gulf and they're insistent on not being bludgeoned by Western powers. You can follow us at BBC_WHYS if you are on Twitter. We're going to take a break for a couple of moments and then we'll carry on talking about Iran and America. Hi there, this is Ros Atkins with you live on World Have Your Say on BBC World News. Let's bring in my colleague Jill McGivering, who's over with the World Have Your Say team, taking all of your calls. Hi Jill, what have you heard so far?
Hi Ros, well, we're getting calls coming in from India and Pakistan, from Australia and Hong Kong, from Kenya and Nigeria, and hearing quite a lot of themes just starting to emerge. Some suggesting that quite a few people supportive of Iran, talking about issues to do with double standards in the West, saying the US and other countries in Europe already have nuclear weapons, surely it's normal and natural that Iran would want to develop its own program. So some people being cautiously supportive. Also some people suggesting that the US involvement may be also to do with its own vested interests. Jim in Tennessee has just been on the line. He was saying that the key to American involvement, as he sees it, is Israel, no more, no less. There are others, though, who are particularly concerned about where this is leading to, a sense that Iran is now quite a considerable threat to peace and an anxiety that this is going to escalate. Dave in Australia said on the line, he's just been calling us and saying military action is the best solution because now there's no other option left, there's nothing else on the table. What do you think about that? If you want to comment, if you're listening and you want to get hold of us and make a comment, do call. The team is ready and waiting. The number is on the screen. And of course, if you want to contact us on Twitter, the hashtag is WHYS.
Jill, thank you very much indeed. We'll speak to you a little later in the programme. The Facebook address is facebook.com/World Have Your Say. Interesting that Jill there was talking about Israel. Well, we've had further details of this major Israeli-American joint military exercise that's going to take place in the Gulf. Interesting to see that appears to be given extra prominence after those war games from the Iranians. The Iranians also giving more details of further tests that they'll be carrying out in the next few weeks. Hi there, I'm Ross Atkins. Thanks for joining me here on World Have Your Say. We're talking about what the Iranians want from the standoff that they have with primarily the Americans, and we're discussing whether their demands and aspirations are reasonable. Kane's in Ohio, posting at facebook.com/World Have Your Say. If Iran wants respect and recognition, it should cease its antagonism and attempt to contribute to the international community in a positive manner. Well, why don't we put that to some of our guests. Genevieve Abdo is director of the Iran program at the Century Foundation think tank. Genevieve, let me start with you. Do you feel that, aside from the nuclear issue, Iran's contribution to the international community is adequate, is satisfactory?
No, of course not. Iran has not responded, I think, in a way that people believe as an honest broker in either nuclear negotiations or negotiations even way back regarding Afghanistan. And so I think that the problem has been that the window of opportunity which existed, say there have been several windows of opportunity beginning in 2003, that both sides, both the United States and Iran, have missed those windows of opportunity. And the problem we have now is, how do we come back from the brink? And I would recommend that both parties, the 5+1 members of the UN Permanent Security Council and also Iran, try to go back to the negotiating table. And I would assume that now that Iran understands how serious the United States and the European Union are taking this crisis, obviously Iran feels very threatened now. I would hope that the government now is willing to make compromises that are acceptable to Western governments. And I think that that's the only way out of this crisis at this point. I'd also like to add that, despite the fact that, as Mr. Morandi suggests, that Iran feels that it's under siege, that the aggression is coming from the United States, Iran has not really been an honest broker in various engagement attempts throughout at least the Obama administration. So I think that Iran does bear some responsibility in where we are today.
Genevieve, thanks for those comments. And as you're speaking, two new faces were appearing on the screen here on BBC World News. Let me introduce you to them. Amir Paivar is from BBC Persian Television. Amir, thanks for coming on the programme.
Thank you for having me.
And we also have Professor Abbas Adalat from Imperial College London. He's founder of the Campaign Against Sanctions and Military Intervention in Iran. And sir, you're also very welcome onto the programme. Amir, let me start with you. Tell us how your web users and your TV viewers have reacted to this week of tension.
Well, as far as I know, the opinion back in Iran is...
Sorry, one moment. I think we've got a problem with your mic. We're going to fix that. In the meantime, Professor Adalat, let me bring you in. How have you reacted to this week?
Well, actually, there is a precedent for all of this, because 60 years ago today, the United Kingdom, with support from the US, put an oil embargo on Iran, who was led by Dr. Mohammad Mossadegh, trying to nationalize the oil industry. And when that oil embargo failed to topple the elected government of Iran, the CIA and the MI6 engineered the 1953 coup against Dr. Mohammad Mossadegh and brought back the hated Shah. So Iranians have seen the game of deception and hypocrisy that the West has been playing against them. And there is a proverb in English which says, old habits die hard. The UK, the US, and the Western allies are pursuing exactly the same game of deception and hypocrisy, this game of imperialist intervention in the region for the sake of domination.
All right, so you say there is a trust deficit from Iranians towards Britain and America. Amir, do you find that among your web users and TV viewers?
Definitely. Back to the history, there's a lot of mistrust between Iran and the West. The Iranians, the people as well, don't necessarily have good memories of the foreign intervention in the country. That's why the public opinion in the country is quite galvanized these days. Having said so, although there's been traditionally a resentment against foreign intervention, I can see there's more and more people coming out kind of wishing for a war in vain, thinking if reforms don't come from within, we don't have a whole lifetime to wait. Let the foreigners come and help us change the country.
And on that issue, let's pull up this message from Hans in the States, posting at facebook.com/worldhaveyoursay. He writes, if Iran were not threatened by foreign enemies, there would be much more internal pressure for reform, liberalisation and greater democracy in Iranian society. I just wonder, Professor Edelat, whether you think that is true. Do you think the Americans and British are undermining people who would like to see Iran become a fuller democracy?
Obviously, if you commit a whole series of acts of war against the country, when you encircle that country with military bases, when you put sanctions which are tantamount to economic warfare against the country, when you, with a thin veiled disguise, you say that all options are on the table, meaning that you're threatening the country, there is a stage of siege, of course, in the country. And no government can possibly allow full democratic rights in such a condition, although I think Iran is doing much better than the allies of the United States in the region. So in that sense, I think all the human rights violations and democratic rights violations are at least partially because of the Western atrocities and Western threats and Western pressure against Iran.
Genevieve, I can see you reacting to that. Let's bring you in.
Well, I think, absolutely, that, as we hear from people inside the country, there is a great level of fear. And what we're hearing also is that the authorities now are once again cracking down on the internet and trying to prevent people from any sources of independent or outside information. And of course, this has been going on for a long time, particularly after the election in 2009. But there is definitely a relationship between the feeling, the perception that a war is imminent and repression at home. The Iranians, of course, if there is an attack, they want to make sure that the population rallies around the regime, and if they and the risk that they have independent information might jeopardize this. So, if their population starts reading Western headlines that Iran is responsible for the war, that Iran is responsible for sanctions, this is not good for the authorities. So they're already responding by repressing the population even more than they've repressed the population since 2009.
Genevieve, you're in Washington, D.C. Callum's watching us in New Zealand. He says, I believe that Iran wants to be respected by the international community after being treated so badly for so long. If Anyi in Nigeria on our Facebook page says, when the gods decide to bring a king down, they make him go crazy first. Iran is doing everything to fulfill this prophecy. We've also had calls in from Brazil, Germany, Afghanistan, Iraq, Australia, Nigeria, Kenya and Pakistan. If we don't manage to get all of you on the air, and I'm afraid that's inevitable, we will put the comments you're calling in up on the screen. We'll speak to Jill McGivering again as well. And there's World Have Your Say Extra in just over 4 hours' time. So we'll have a chance to speak to some more of you then. And do remember, as you're watching, if you want to get involved in all the discussions online, it's facebook.com/World Have Your Say, and also we're on Twitter at BBC_WHYS. I can see a couple more messages just coming in before we take a break. Nazir in Nigeria has tweeted, the West again looking for trouble when there is none, just like they did in Iraq. And Jose in the Philippines, thanks for staying up late to watch us. Jose, why can't Iran open the doors and allow the inspectors in? It does sound like they're hiding something. We'll keep on talking about this here on BBC World News in a couple of minutes' time. Hi, I'm Ros Atkins. On this week's World Have Your Say, we're talking about what Iran wants. There's been a huge amount of interest in these Iranian war games and that threat to shut the Strait of Hormuz. But beyond objecting to the latest raft of sanctions from the US, what outcome is Iran looking for? What role does it really want for itself in the region and in the wider world? And what kind of military arsenal does it aspire to have? And of course, the follow-on issue from all of those questions is whether its ambitions are reasonable. We've Iranians and Americans ready to give us their answers, but of course, you're welcome to take part too. We're on Twitter, Facebook, Google+, email, text, and the phone. So if you want to get involved, you're not short of options. And the number to call is country code 44 2070 83 72 72. Just in case you're wondering, we'll call you back if you come on air, so you won't have to pay for any of the call. And if we don't have time to get you on, we may well put your comment up on screen, or we'll get you involved in World Have Your Say Extra, which is on in about 4 hours' time from now. First, though, let's look at the day's main stories, starting in Syria, where state television is reporting that a suicide bomber has blown himself up in Damascus. It says between 10 and 25 people were killed and many more were wounded. A Turkish court has ordered that a former head of the armed forces be remanded in custody. General İlker Başbuğ will stand trial for organising an alleged plot to overthrow the government. The British Foreign Secretary, William Hague, says the momentum for change in Burma is real, but he has warned against relaxing pressure. He says much more work needs to be done. On Thursday, he met pro-democracy leader Aung San Suu Kyi at her home in Rangoon. A new study suggests that memory loss and other brain functions may start to decline when people reach their mid-40s. That's much earlier than was previously thought. Writing in the British Medical Journal, the scientists say they studied the mental capabilities of thousands of civil servants over a period of 10 years. And figures released in the US say the unemployment rate fell last month to 8.5%. That's the lowest level in nearly 3 years. The number of new jobs created was also up by around 200,000. Both figures were much better than analysts had expected. Well, I was mentioning the phone number to call. Khan used it just a few minutes ago. He's called us up from Pakistan. Hi, Khan. Thanks for getting in touch. What's your view of what the Iranians want?
They just want to be left alone. Not too long ago, the international community failed Iraq by letting another country attack it on a hunch that there were weapons of mass destruction. They were hiding the weapons of mass destruction. Again, the United States is rattling their sabers and going around putting economic sanctions, and this country just wants to be left alone to go forward and progress. But the United States just has these hunches, and they want to go around and start attacking countries on these hunches. And it's very important for the international community to put a stop to this and let these people know that they just can't go around putting economic sanctions and destroying countries on hunches.
Well, there's a couple of points to make there, Khan, and we'll pick up on them. Thank you very much indeed. I would say that it's not just the US introducing sanctions. The UN has supported some sanctions, not all the same sanctions that the US has introduced, but the UN has backed sanctions on 4 separate occasions. Now, let me take some of those points and put them to the guests who are with us. Dr. Mohammed Morandi is head of North American Studies at the University of Tehran. He's live from Beirut. And we also have guests in Washington, D.C. Matthew Koenig's a fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. Last year, he worked as a special advisor to the U.S. Defense Secretary's office, and he's also written an online article called Time to Attack Iran, which has been tweeted a great deal in the past couple of days. And Professor Abbas Edelat is founder of the Campaign Against Sanctions and Military Intervention in Iran. Now, Matthew, maybe I could start with you here, and a lot of our viewers are raising this issue. Do you not have any concerns about supporting an attack on Iran over alleged weapons of mass destruction so soon after America went into Iraq on just the same premise, and it turned out there were no weapons of the sort?
Well, I think the comparisons to Iraq are inevitable, and I understand why people make those comparisons. But I also think it's highly misleading. They're very different cases. First, with Iran, they're engaging in activity that doesn't make sense unless they were interested in building nuclear weapons. The IAEA report in November detailed the work that Iran has done on nuclear weapons design. They wouldn't be doing work on nuclear weapons design unless they were interested in building nuclear weapons. Second, I believe the caller was from Pakistan. This isn't just a U.S.-Iran issue. If Iran acquires nuclear weapons, there would be, I think, potentially devastating consequences for the entire international community, not the least of which is possible nuclear war in the Middle East. And then the third thing I would say is that a major difference also between the war in Iraq and a possible military confrontation with Iran is that no one here is talking about an invasion and complete overthrow of the Iranian government. What I advocated in the article was a surgical strike against Iran's key nuclear facilities. So the comparisons to Iraq and Afghanistan, I think, are inevitable, but they're misleading. A more accurate analogy might be, say, the bombing of Serbia in the late 90s, or even the commando raid against Osama bin Laden in Pakistan last year.
I wonder, those of you watching, if you're persuaded by the arguments that Matthew is making. Do tweet us using the WHYS hashtag, or get in touch on Facebook, facebook.com/worldhaveyoursay. I can see calls coming in from Sierra Leone, Qatar, Egypt, Barbados, Jamaica, Tajikistan and Saudi Arabia. Do keep those comments coming in. Khan in Pakistan, thank you for getting in touch. Let's shift from Washington, D.C. in Pakistan to Germany. This from an editorial in the German newspaper Süddeutsche Zeitung. Writing in their editorial, they say, there is little to suggest that Iran will back down over sanctions, but it's worth a try. The alternatives would be far more uncomfortable. Iran with nuclear weapons or an Israeli military strike. Well, I wonder if, Professor Adlad, I could bring you in here. Wouldn't it make it easier if Iran was more open with the IAEA inspectors?
Well, before that, can I make it absolutely clear that a surgical strike against Iranian nuclear plants would be illegal under international law, would be against the UN Charter. Russia and China would veto any such resolution in the UN Security Council. And what your first guest, has advocated here is exactly the crime for which the leaders of the Nazi Germany were put on trial and convicted in the Nuremberg trials. So it's unprovoked, illegal act of aggression. It's a war crime. It's a crime against peace. It's exactly these crimes for which Tony Blair and President Bush have been tried for and convicted in the Kuala Lumpur court, international court, just a couple of months ago. So that's the first point. So the second point is that Iran has been completely open. Iran has gone well beyond its obligations to cooperate with the IAEA. And to make it very clear that Iran has been actually an honest broker, let's just imagine what happened in April 2010, 2 years ago, just less than 2 years ago. President Obama wrote to the President of Brazil and Prime Minister of Turkey, urging them to persuade Iran to deposit 1,200 kilograms of its low-enriched 3.5% enriched uranium in Turkey in return for 20% enriched uranium as fuel rods to be used for the medical reactor in Taiwan.
Okay, so
Turkey and Brazil brokered that deal with Iran just a few weeks later. But when the Tehran Declaration announced in exactly the same terms that Obama had requested,
all right, so
Mrs. Clinton dismissed that and proposed a new round of sanctions.
Professor Adlad, let me come in here, sir. You're making a very strong point that Iran has gone well beyond what is necessary from it. Let's bring in another guest here, Dr. Mohammed Morandi from Tehran University, but live with us from Beirut. Sir, do you agree with the points the professor was making, or do you think that perhaps Iran could do more to show to the world that it's not interested in a nuclear weapon?
Well, first of all, if we are speaking about the world, the international community, as I said earlier, the vast majority of countries, meaning the non-aligned movement, they have supported Iran's position from the very start. So let's be clear, this is basically white Europeans. This is the West, not the whole world. That's not the international community. The Iranians right now, they have inspectors from the IAEA, and they're constantly in Iran. So it's misleading to say that the Iranians have not opened their doors. Also, as Dr. Professor Adlad pointed out, the Iranians went out of the way to meet what Obama wanted. When the Iranians signed the Tehran Declaration, Obama lied to the Brazilians. He slapped them in the face and imposed new sanctions. More recently, the Russians came to the Iranians and gave a new proposal, a step-for-step proposal, and they said that the Americans are on board. The Iranians reluctantly agreed because they had certain reservations. But it turned out that the Americans were not on board. Okay, so the Americans' problem is not really the nuclear problem. Just one issue, just one other point. I would like to point out that the United States has invaded country after country, drone attacks in different countries, and Iran is not playing a positive role in the region. The U.S. supported Saddam Hussein and helped him use, and the Europeans used chemical weapons against Iranians. I was a victim of those chemical weapons. People in Iran are today dying because of those chemical weapons. And Iran is the country that is making a problem here. This is extraordinary, and this is the utter arrogance coming from Western countries.
And let's put those points to Dr. Manzoor Farhang, a former Iranian ambassador to the UN, who's just appeared on the screen. Those of you watching will have seen. Sir, what about those points there that actually the world should be more preoccupied with American military aggression than what Iran might be capable of?
First of all, the decisions of the International Atomic Energy Agency has been approved by the governing board of the agency. And the decisions of the governing board are consensus-based. And there are also many members of the non-allied board as members of the International Atomic Energy Commission governing board. So the decisions and the concerns and questions raised by the IAEA are not simply the preference of the Western world, but experts whose judgments have been supported internationally. Second, it is true that the U.S. threat to Iran is definitely a cause of concern. An overwhelming majority of Iranian people oppose any kind of military action against Iran. At the same time, we cannot understand the threat of war without understanding the nature of the Iranian regime. Since its inception, the Iranian regime has been in the business of making enemies. For example, Iran's
But Dr. Farhang, it hasn't been in the business of invading countries, has it? That's been America's business in recent years. Iran hasn't invaded anyone.
Has been in the business of invading the American embassy 32 years ago, British embassy a couple months ago, and also threatening other nations of the region. Why is it that the entire Arab states of the Persian Gulf are united in their concern about Iran's nuclear program?
Okay, well, so this is an issue I'm curious to get a response from our viewers about. Those of you watching, wherever you are in the world, do you see Iran or America as the bigger military threat in the region? I'd be grateful if you wanted to share your opinions on that. The number to call is country code 44 2070 83 72 72. Calls coming in from Latvia, Japan, Uganda, Somalia, and the Maldives. Keep them coming. We'll get as many of you on the air as we can. Hi, I'm Ross Atkins. Thanks for joining me on World Have Your Say. We're talking about Iran after a week of more tension between Iran and America. I can see calls coming in from Ireland and Chile and Malawi. In fact, we'll speak to Patrick in Ireland in just a moment. But first of all, let's bring in Jill McGivering, who's with the World Have Your Say team, who can give us a more detailed rundown of what is coming in on the phones. Hi, Jill. What have you got?
Calls so far from almost 40 countries, Ross, including Somalia, Latvia, Afghanistan and the Maldives. A lot of people clearly very focused on the way they think this crisis could escalate and the threat to international peace. Ali in southern Iran called to say that he's concerned that people don't appreciate how serious the situation is at the moment. We are peaceful people, he said. Please don't undermine us. And a similar sentiment actually from Emma in Melbourne, who also urged caution, saying Iranians are good people. Please, they shouldn't be pushed around.
Thank you very much indeed, Jill. Well, I was mentioning Patrick. Let's bring him in. Hi there. Thanks for tuning to BBC World News in Ireland. Patrick, what's your view of the current standoff between Iran and America?
Well, I personally think it's quite complicated, and I think it's got many layers to it. And like the viewer in Iran or in Australia said, the leadership of Iran are not representative of the Israeli, the views of the leadership in Iran. They're not representative of the views of the Iranian people. And personally, I would see Mahmoud Ahmadinejad as a massive threat to stability in the region and to world peace as well. Mahmoud Ahmadinejad is a guy who has made some crazy statements in the past about Israel and who has made some bizarre statements in the United Nations. He is clearly an unstable man, and I wouldn't trust him with nuclear weapons. And it's clear that they are developing nuclear weapons and that they aim to have that capability within a few years.
OK, so you're concerned about Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. Let's quickly bring in Amir from the BBC's Persian service. We've got these elections coming up in March, Amir. Tell us a little bit about that and whether those are a potential threat to Mahmoud Ahmadinejad's power.
Well, the rivalry has already started. Iran's regime is right now engaged in a power struggle from within between the supreme leader who has the last say and the power, and the government of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad and his allies, who are allegedly planning to continue to be in power for a long time. And they see the parliament elections as a prelude, as a jumping board for the next presidential election. So they really want to get into the parliament as many of their allies and members as possible, so that it paves the way for the presidential elections next year.
And I would add that if people want more on those elections, you can go to bbcpersian.com and bbc.com/news. Now let's shift from London to Canada, because Siamak's joining us, an Iranian living in Canada. What's your point?
Well, I think the current situation between the U.S. and Iran is, as many audience mentioned, is getting more serious. The problem is that I think as the West is pushing for more sanctions, and Iranians see themselves more isolated, and they don't have any other choice except to react or to all these things. I think the kind of threatening of shutting down the Hormuz Strait is a kind of a response which might be in the short term a solution for Iranians. They see it as a problem in the short term to push the oil prices up, but then it might not stay at.
And that's an interesting point, Siamak, about the short term and the long term. Lots of people concerned about even moves which may have short term benefits may have detrimental long term consequences. Siamak, thank you very much indeed. Now we're going to shift subjects quickly, because earlier World Have Your Say broadcast our first ever radio programme from Burma, and we thought you'd like to hear a little part of it. Here are our guests in Rangoon talking with a fellow Burmese in London.
People tend to forget that we have had a long military junta ruling the country for a while. What I might say for those in the Western world, at least, is, be patient. Change in Burma would come, but that it will come eventually.
Yeah, things will not change overnight, but it's very positive, and we have to embrace it.
I'd like to add to what Ko Lin Sang said just now. Some people see this democratic change as, coming too quick, too soon. Ordinary people see this change as, positive, but there is a pocket of population who are quite skeptical about the so-called changes because actually a lot of things have not changed yet.
It was a fascinating programme. If you put World Have Your Say podcast into a search engine, you'll find it and be able to listen to the whole programme. A big thank you to all of our guests on today's discussion about Iran. We've had an extraordinary response. Calls still coming in from Belgium, Thailand and Argentina. We'll speak to some more of you on World Have Your Say Extra in 3.5 hours.